this work is so rooted in its time and presents such an interesting picture of Enlightenment France that I think it's going to be important with us to kind of set the stage a bit, establish a sense of the field before we dive into the particular lives of these women. So I want you, in the quickest way possible, to give us a description of the intellectual terrain of Enlightenment France. So what notion of science was developing at that time, what the situation of women was, and how they were able to participate in and yet also were excluded from the science.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for coming. Is this working?
Yes. Close to your mouth.
Okay. And thank you for that very stimulating question, but it's a tall order.
It's a tough one.
It's a tall order. So I guess I mean, one could speak forever about the importance of the Enlightenment and the fascination of that time. One of the things that I find so extraordinary about this period is that for me, it's the threshold of the modern world. And it's a period that it's an intellectual movement that existed under severe censorship of the Ancien Regime. Both the church and the state tried to silence anything progressive, anything disruptive. And so some works were published with royal privilege, which was the closest thing to a copyright. Some works were published with a tacit permission, which was the invention of a man named Malesherbes, who was the head of the book trade for 10 or so years in the middle of the century, and who was a friend of the philosophes. And the philosophes, of course, as I'm sure most of you know in this room, were the ones who were really generating this Enlightenment movement in France, which then influenced such a thing in every other country, because we have the Aufklärung and we have the century of light, and it's a motif, this idea taking thinking out of the shadows into something more spacious and more curious and more free. That was what the Enlightenment was trying to do, and it influenced other countries as well. So that's very, what you've asked me to do is almost impossible, but I think that situates the Enlightenment as something which is a resistance movement. Yes. Which can't be too revolutionary because it'll be shut down. Yes. Which has to play the game, and which is just an extraordinary time, sprinkled, of course, by all the great philosophers' names that, again, with which most of you are probably familiar. Mm-hmm. So that's the guys.
Those are the men.
Yes.
Let's get to the women. They're more fun. They're more interesting. So what was it like for women at this time? Could they access education? Could they exist in society the way men did? What was their relationship with marriage?
Okay, so the men of this period in France, that's what we're talking about, had the satisfaction of knowing that they were part of a historical movement, and that they were part of something. They had a sense of belonging, whether they were working for a particular newspaper, whether they were working for, whether they were members of an academy, whether they were contributing to the Encyclopédie, the great magisterial work of the Enlightenment. The men knew that they were doing something purposeful. Women had no access to these things and no sororité, right? They didn't have a sisterhood. They didn't even these extraordinary women of mine were not connected and didn't know each other. So you ask about, so they were excluded, in other words, from all of these institutions which were created by the Enlightenment. Marriage was devastating for women in this period and in the previous period. They had, it's often been said, the rights of the criminal and the insane. If you were a widow, it was much better. But if you were a married woman, there was very little you could do on your own.
Yeah, and these women all had such interesting relationships to marriage and to sexuality in general, which we'll get to if we have time. But I'd like to highlight these 6 women first, who came from such diverse backgrounds. They were practicing in different fields. They had different approaches to science and scientific legacies, and notably, they all achieved firsts. So you write in this work that Ferron became the first woman to champion Newtonianism in France, Lepaute, the first French woman to be elected to a scientific academy, Baré, the first woman to sail around the world, Basse-Porte, the first and only woman to secure the coveted post of dessinateur du roi in the Royal Botanical Gardens, Biron, the first person to teach general anatomy and sex education, very fun, using models of her own invention, and d'Arconville, the first person to suspect, over a century before Pasteur, that the cause of putrefaction was airborne. So this is such an impressive roster of such wildly interesting women. And I think it's really powerful to read this work because studying them and placing the focus on them also generates a new image of the Enlightenment and of the spirit of the Enlightenment. And so I think we can study the images of these women and study the Enlightenment at the same time. So I want to start with one aspect that we've already discussed a bit, which is the fact that the Enlightenment was this intensely social period and that the production of knowledge was collaborative and involved a spirit of critique, kind of mutually creative processes. There were salons, there were networks, and this was a process from which women were largely excluded to a certain extent, though these women navigated this social aspect in different ways. And one example is Madame Ferrand. So I'd like for you to tell us who she was briefly, what she did, and then how she navigated this social dimension of the Enlightenment.
Mademoiselle Ferrand.
Excusez-moi.
Excusez-vous. She very, very deliberately chose a female partner so that she wouldn't be encumbered by motherhood or any of the restrictions of marriage. Mademoiselle Ferrand was an invalid. She was a brilliant mathematician. She worked on algebraic curves and her writing has been lost. Her papers have been lost, just like Madame de Potte's astronomical papers on the transit of Venus are lost. So that's one of the things when you work on these women, you have to figure out how to reconstruct them other ways. She had a salon, which because she was an invalid, people came to her. So for example, the Bernoulli, are you familiar with the Bernoulli dynasty of scientists? Does that name sound familiar to some of you? I see some of you nodding. Yeah, so the Bernoulli brothers were touring France on a scientific tour in the early 1730s. And who do they go to discuss Newton? Mademoiselle Ferrand, which is extraordinary because the French were very chauvin and they were Cartesians. That was not okay to be a Newtonian in the early 1700s. In the academy, there was nobody really pushing for this. She was a Newtonian. And the cover of the book is a picture of her. It's a cropped picture of a portrait that she had done by the pastelist Quentin de la Tour, the greatest pastelist of the time. And this was how she wanted to be remembered. I don't know if you can see from there, but the huge volume behind her says de Newton at the top. She's meditating on Newton. This is how, and she was dying, by the way, when she had this portrait painted, but she was determined to be remembered that way.
And so she was determined to take this really quite revolutionary stance that was quite controversial. And she was surrounded by quite a revolutionary and controversial group as well. And she was really shaped by and also shaped this spirit of mutual critique, collaboration. So she helped with Condillac to write his essay, which was quite significant. And she also believed in this way, the transmission of knowledge and the mutual creation of knowledge. And this leads us to another kind of characteristic of the Enlightenment spirit that I think these women really embody and bring out, which is the value of education and the value of creating these sort of, I know this is anachronistic to say, but pedagogical tools in order to make sure that knowledge is transmittable. And we see this most specifically with Biron and Basport, I think, who are both really concerned with the use of images to transmit knowledge. So the reproduction of the objects of study so that others can partake in those and share those as well. So I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about those two women, and then specifically Biron's commitment to education and what her relationship was to female education.
Okay, let me, if you don't mind, just say one more thing about Ferrand before we leave her.
Please.
So not only was she a mathematician, but she worked with Condillac, who wrote many books, but one, the most famous, is the Traité des Sensations, which she collaborated on, and she was dead by the time it was published, but he does a 15-page homage to her in that book, basically saying he couldn't have written it without her. And it's an epistemological treatise. It's a treatise about how we know things. And his theory, of course, was that we, from the title, Traité des Sensations, we learn everything through our senses. So now, Biron and Basport. So the first, in the order that they appear in this book, Basport is a botanist. She's a botanical illustrator. She works at the Jardin du Roi and she's the only woman, as you said before, that ever had that post. And she kept it for almost half a century, and she refused to retire. Nobody was going to push her aside. And in her
How old was she when she finished working?
80, and she died. She died, and I mean, she didn't stop working. She died, it said, with a paintbrush in her hand. Okay, and her late illustrations have her age on them, not just her signature on them, but her age. We've never seen. I mean, it's uncommon to do that.
She wanted it to be seen that she was this old and she was still working.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay, so she was about 18 years older than Biéron. She also taught girls flower painting, as she wanted them to have a marketable skill. She wanted them to be economically independent. And one of the people who came to her for lessons was this Mademoiselle Biéron. Both of these ladies were Mademoiselle, by the way, and they were each other's partner. Okay, so here, another case, another creative way to avoid marriage, right? Okay, Biéron was about 18 years younger, and when she came, it was pretty clear that she was gifted for sculpture rather than painting. And so Besport pushed her in the direction of doing some work on anatomical parts. And she became an expert anatomist who had a museum. You asked me to stress her commitment to education.
Yeah, well, tell us about her museum first. It's so fascinating.
So in her home, she had a medical museum. What was it? All these anatomical parts, which she had made with extreme accuracy. Benjamin Franklin was one of her huge fans. He would visit Paris with his dear friend, John Pringle, who was the physician to the King of England. And they looked at Biéron's stuff and they said, all that is missing is the stench. That's how realistic her parts were, her body parts. So she did countless dissections in order to be able to reproduce the various parts of the body accurately. And it was a museum where you were supposed to touch things. You were encouraged to touch things. What do these organs feel like? And she had a trade secret. The formula that she used was clearly wax, but it must also have had feathers and resin and different things in it because it did not melt and it did not break. And she went to her grave with that secret.
Well, tragically, she shared it at the end, and then the archival documents weren't valued, and it was lost.
It's not tragic. It's wonderful that it's wonderful that they lost it. She was forced during the revolution to reveal. She wanted to get her pension, and they said, "Okay, but you have to tell us how you make this stuff." And she had to divulge it, and then the idiots lost it. Thank goodness.
Some bureaucrat.
Some sort of. I don't know. I was going to say, poetic justice, whatever, anatomical justice.
Mm-hmm.
But among the things that she modeled were sexual organs, and she taught many girls sort of about their bodies and what to expect when they married and what to expect when they bore children. It was extraordinary. Nobody was doing anything like that. And the medical faculty hated her, of course. And she had to flee twice to England because they were trying to close her down. She was very committed to education.
Yes, and to her pension as well. So the French continue to fight for their pensions, centuries later. But I think you write something wonderful about this. You write that because she was a very devout woman as well, and you write that she did not experience her studies of the body as a violation, but instead as an educational necessity. It's this idea that she had a duty to educate others, including other women, about the human body in general and their own body, the body that they were living in, generating this understanding of themselves.
You study the dead for the living, for the sake of the living. That was her commitment.
And I think that the way that she valued education, studying the dead for the living, knowledge as a good in itself, is actually slightly in tension with another characteristic of the Enlightenment that's emerging at this time, which is this kind of mad dash to be the first to discover things and to stamp your name on it. And this is, you argue, a particularly masculine trait, and that men saw themselves as participating in this grand narrative of the men of history who are the scientists, the discoverers, and who want to be recognized and go down in eternal glory. And this is a narrative that, lives on in France today. We look at the Pantheon, which says, aux grands hommes, yeah, reconnaissante. And the stakes were slightly different for women. Both this desire for recognition, which is not, it's not entirely negative because recognition has social value, but it also might be motivated by what you call dirty power. And so for women, you write that they were motivated not by fame, glory, or fortune, what Dorinda Outram has called dirty power, but by genuine thirst to satisfy their deep curiosity about the natural world and determined to make useful contributions to scientific knowledge. So I want to ask you if you think that this distinction between, you know, the dirty power, the desire for recognition, and then the pure search of knowledge, if that's a sustainable distinction. And I think we can consider someone like Madame Leput, who's really concerned with recognition and being recognized in order to interrogate this. So tell us who she was and what her relationship to recognition, fame, glory, everything else was.
Okay, so she's the second Mademoiselle Ferrand of the cover picture is the first chapter, and Madame Leput, who was married, she was Madame Leput, was an astronomer, and she's the subject of the second chapter. And so let me explain how she handled her marriage. Her husband was one of the royal clockmakers, and he was apparently a very fine artisan with no conception whatsoever of the intellectual level that his wife was functioning on. Zero. So she was responsible, if you can get your mind around this, for doing the calculations that made possible the accurate prediction of the return of Halley's Comet. This is huge. She worked with two other mathematicians / astronomers. One was Clairaut, who was very famous in his day and absolutely refused to give her any credit whatsoever. He's the one who stood up at the Academy of Sciences and said, on such and such a day and such a night, this will be visible in the sky, plus or minus a month, because this is a comet with a periodicity of about 80 years. So the calculation is huge. And it was a race against time. A prediction isn't worth much unless you predict before the thing happens, right? So they were up night and day for 6 months. How do we know this? Because the third person who worked on this, not Clairaut, not Madame Leput herself, but a man named Jérôme Lalande, for whom there is a street named in Paris, spills the beans. He tells the story, basically. He and Madame Leput worked closely on many things. And what did she do? She brought him into her household. He was about 10 years younger than she. And she figured, she basically created a ménage à trois. It was very chaste. This was not a sexual relationship. This was to keep her mind alive. He was going to come live with her and her husband. And the husband was fine because Lalande helped the husband, who was a clockmaker, make astronomical clocks and convinced him that there was a huge market out there for this. And so it was very chummy and happy, and they lived together in 3 different places for about 20 years. So that's how she handled her marriage, by really decentering her husband, who was quite ornery from what we know, and having somebody who stimulated her brain in the home.
And so she was someone who, my reading of her is that she was quite capable of standing up for herself and
Yes.
demanding that she be seen as both a scientist and a woman. So for example, she's drawing maps of ellipses, thank you.
Eclipses, sorry.
Eclipses, thank you. Lots of
Okay.
E words, yes. And she writes on it that, you know, this was drawn by the same woman who
did
drew this
something
previous,
else.
yes,
Exactly.
stressing
So
the
she
fact.
makes eclipse charts. I mean, she did the Halley's Comet thing, that was 1759. And then she made a chart for a complete eclipse that was going to happen. She superimposed a kind of band on a map of Europe to show where the sun would be completely blanked out and where it would be partially blanked out. And it was an amazing thing. And then she made another one for how it would look from Paris, which was not going to be a complete eclipse, but a partial eclipse. And she circulated these things, always calling attention to herself, always putting her name on there. And she was the one, I think you mentioned this briefly in passing, that she was the first woman to be accepted in a scientific academy in France. It was not the Académie des Sciences of Paris, which didn't accept a woman until 1970s.
Wow. 1970s.
1970s. She was, and by the way, the Tour Eiffel, which is right here, has the names of all kinds of people on all 4 sides, great scientists of France.
Are there any women?
Not a woman. Not even Sophie Germain, who did studies of elasticity, which were essential for the construction of the thing. Not even her. Okay, so the Academy doesn't, the Paris Academy doesn't accept a woman until very recently, within the last 50 years. But she gets accepted to the Académie de Béziers in the south of France. And she gets accepted because of two papers she's written. She writes on the transits of Venus of 1761 and 1769, which are lost. So we don't know the substance of these papers, but they must have been pretty impressive.
And so while she's being recognized by the Academy of Sciences, excuse me, and while she's writing her name on these charts that she's grading, there's another figure in the story who's Madame d'Arconville, who is doing the opposite, the complete opposite. She is writing completely anonymously. Can you tell us about her work and her relationship to recognition as a woman and as a scientist?
Okay, so Madame Thiel d'Arconville is the subject of the last chapter, and she was an extraordinarily rich aristocrat. And a lot of aristocrats in 18th century France were poor. You know, they had whatever, noble blood, but they didn't have their fortune any longer. She was from a really rich family, married at 14 into an even richer family, gave her husband an heir, a spare, and a third son, all before she was 19, and then decided, okay, I can do science now. And she did. But she also wrote novels, and she wrote histories, and she wrote moral tales, and she wrote anonymously all the time. It gave her tremendous freedom. She wrote on marriage. It would make your blood run cold, but nobody knew who she was. It was just this book on marriage, another book on friendship, another book on the passions. And she had the veil of anonymity, which was her tactic.
And so this allowed her to enter into the society of men, the intellectual society around her, slipping in through the cracks, masking her gender. She wrote, you quote her in the book, she writes, should women exhibit science or wit? If their works are bad, they are heckled. If they are good, they are appropriated by others. All they have left is the ridicule for having declared themselves authors. So she's aware of the dangers, the risks one takes when one is both a woman and an author, or a woman and a scientist. And her choice, given this knowledge that she had, was to conceal this fact. And you identify this as you said, a tactic, which you oppose to a strategy. And this is a distinction that you maintain throughout the entire book. And it's a really interesting way of understanding these women's relationship to power and to society. So can you explain this distinction between strategy and tactic, and tell us both about how d'Arconville navigated this line, and then also about our final woman, Baré, who also had her own tactic, which served her in a different way.
Okay, so I didn't invent this distinction. This comes actually from a philosopher named Michel de Certeau, whose work you might want to look at because he's fascinating. Sorry?
Yes, he's excellent.
You agree?
Yes,
okay.
Big fan.
And he wrote many things. He's no longer alive. But one of the things he wrote was a book translated into English as The Practice of Everyday Life. And he gives the example of a city planned out by those in power who have a strategy that, let's say, the streets should be some kind of grid like this, and that's how the city should be navigated. But the average walker is going to find shortcuts, climb fences, take alleyways, right? So that's the strategy, is the grid, and then the sort of resistance, the creative, unique ways of dealing with the grid, finding play in the machine, finding ways to sort of push back against this imposed order. That's the tactics. And this is, again, his formulation. But for me, it was extraordinarily useful for every one of my women, even though what they did was so different, one from another. But each of them figured out some way to make this. They couldn't, of course, be too obvious, because then they would have been shut down. So they had to figure out very creative ways to cope. So if you think of Ferrand, it was her invalidism, right? And each one of these women did something. And so Thiel d'Arconville, of course, chose anonymity. That was her way of doing creating a safe space for herself, doing what she wanted to do, and still being able to do it. I mean, that was the thing. Not being made fun of, not being ridiculed, because nobody knew who she was. Of course, her inner circle knew who she was. Some of the great chemists of the day knew who she was, her great work was a treatise, if you can imagine, on putrefaction. This is what she thought was just the greatest thing. And her house, she had many terres, she had many homes in the provinces, but her house in Paris is now the Musée de la Chasse. It's a mansion. So picture these experiments that she did of rotting eggs and meat in various solvents, because she's trying to find an antiseptic substance, basically. She's trying to arrest decay. And that's what her whole treatise is about. And
we'll get to audience questions at the end. Yes.
no, the traité en putréfaction is anonymous.
So
it's anonymous. It says it's by the author of the translation of Shaw's Chemical Lectures, but that Chemical Lectures translation is not identified as by her either. So she does create a trail. She's, I did this, but I also did that, but I also did that. But who she is not revealed.
And so we can consider strategy to be this larger society of men
Yes.
who have created this kind of system of power into which women are placed, in which they are trying to navigate without necessarily trying to dismantle it, right? These aren't necessarily revolutionaries,
No.
but they're trying to exist in it and trying to creatively work through it in such a way that doesn't limit their own personal freedom. And so one tactic is this anonymity, and then another one is the one that Mademoiselle Baré explores. Can you tell us, she's our last woman that we're going to get to before we talk more about biography in general, but tell us what her work was and what her tactic was.
Sure. So that's Jeanne Baré, who was a servant and who was from Bourgogne and who was hired to be the gouvernante for a little boy who was the son of a naturalist, a pretty well-known naturalist named Philibert Commerson. And Philibert Commerson had lost his wife and needed somebody to help him take care of his new baby. And he hired Jeanne Baré. She was just a servant. But then he inoculated her. Well, he also impregnated her, but he inoculated her with his passion for botany. I mean, this was how he spoke. Everybody who was going to be important in his life needed to share his passion for botany. And so what happens is they end up moving to Paris, leaving the little boy she was hired to take care of with a very reluctant, sort of sanctimonious uncle. And they go to Paris. She has the illegitimate child, gives him to wet nurse where he dies, which was fairly common in 18th century France. That wet nurses just didn't have the nourishment to take care of a lot of kids and took on a lot of kids to nurse because they needed the money. So it was a kind of infanticide almost. But anyway, they lost the child. And then Commerson, who has now moved to Paris and is in the Jardin des Plantes, he's working with Buffon, he's working with Bernard de Jussieu. He's tapped to go on Bougainville's round the world voyage. And by this time, he and Jeanne Baré have become inseparable, and she's also become indispensable to him because he's taught her botany. He's inoculated her with his passion for botany.
He's planted the seed.
And he's planted, all right, you said it, but yes, exactly. And so she dresses as a man and gets on board the round the world voyage as his valet. And that's a pretty amazing thing to do.
And the descriptions of this are just so vivid and rich, that she's binding her chest and dressing in clothing and going on these just grueling expeditions with him. And then what happened when they were found out?
I don't know if I want to give that away.
Okay, you'll have to buy the book and read it. So we have all these different tactics, all these different ways that these women are concealing themselves, but then also emerging in different little pockets of society. And for you, your task is made quite challenging because these women are concealing themselves in various ways. They're not letting their identities be known, whether it's through anonymity or concealing who they are. And so for you as biographer of their lives, there are kind of three levels at which this is challenging work. The first is that if someone's writing anonymously, it's very hard to track them down. But on a larger scale, the papers that these women left behind, as you've stressed, a lot of them were lost or destroyed. And so there's something missing from the archives. There's a material lack there of the documents that would testify to their these women's existence. And then on an even bigger degree than that, and this speaks to what you said about the Eiffel Tower, that there are no women there, these women are undermined societally. And so they're not included in the history books that are being written. They're not being kept in the records. As people are developing these grand narratives of what the Enlightenment is, these women are largely written out of it. And you define this as socially produced obscurity. And so you don't think that these women faded from history because their work was insignificant, but because someone else deemed it insignificant and didn't choose to preserve it. Can you tell us more about what socially produced obscurity means and how you see your work as undoing this?
Yes, but I don't think it's only my 6 women. I think in general, the custodians of culture have not valued the work of women. And there's a very sort of pervasive erasure of the contributions of women in history. So it's not peculiar to my study, but it is an issue for those of us who want to try to revive these stories, who want to reconstruct these lives. How do you do it? So one of the ways, something that was very useful to me, and at the beginning, I have a list of men, and I call it actors in a supporting role, because which is what the Oscars used to say. Now they say, I think, supporting actor, but they used to say actor. That's a category, actors in a supporting role. So I did that because there were men who, of course, were very important to these women. There was a kind of welcome and a kind of hospitality on the part of, which is surprising, on the part of quite a few of these men. But I needed the men because they spoke a lot about my women, whether it was Diderot or Rousseau or d'Alembert or Benjamin Franklin or Condillac or whatever. They left information about these women for us, so that I couldn't dispense with that. But what I relied on much more was their deeds, because deeds don't lie. What did they do? What were the choices they made? How did they live their lives? Who were they with? Where did they live? How did they spend their time? What did they produce, right? So only some of them produced texts. I mean, Bespoke produced these extraordinary botanical illustrations, which exist still. And you can go, well, it's hard, but you can go to the library in the Jardin des Plantes, which was the Jardin du Roi, now it's the Jardin des Plantes, and you can see these, they're on vellum, they're gorgeous things. But you need to make an appointment and get umpteen permissions and wear white gloves. And, these are treasures, but they exist. Biéron's anatomical parts do not exist. They're nowhere. Ferrand's math is lost. Le Pot's astronomy papers are lost, right? Thiroux d'Alconville has all, not only did she have a lot of publications, although she didn't put her name on them, but she also dictated 12 volumes of memoirs at the end of her life, which is the kind of thing that makes a historian salivate. I mean, wow. But then again, that gets us into a whole very sophisticated discussion of memory and I mean, she's old and she's obviously reconstructing things in certain ways which may not be altogether accurate, but nonetheless, she is the person where I was most able to understand what made her tick.
And you write also something that really struck me about this work is that it is so bodily that when you describe these women's lives, I really feel myself kind of on this tossing ship with Baré, or I'm surrounded by rotting corpses with Biron, or rotting eggs, lots of rotting things. And I think that you really pay attention to the role of speculation, of the fact that these were living people who had daily experiences and weren't just detached minds. And that helps you cope with the gaps in the archives that you could imagine where they were. So you write, for historians, hard facts are not all we need. We also wonder, wander, ponder, speculate. Increasingly, historians have been using an active rather than a neutral voice, showing their unique relationships with their subjects, their involvement, borrowing devices from other genres. So tell us about the role of imagination and the body in your biographical work.
Okay. Biography is a patriarchal genre. It was invented by men. It was for the longest time only written about men. Those were the lives that mattered. And it tended to be written in this sort of omniscient voice about a life that made perfect sense from cradle to grave, from womb to tomb. And we know that lives are messy. And so feminist biography has put the teller back in the tale. I'm not the first to do that, but it's a very healthy movement, it seems to me, to make clear that when you work on someone for as long as most of us work on things, and this book
20 years,
this
right?
book just took me ridiculously long, but
Yeah.
anyway, it did finally happen.
It took 20 years. I want to
Well,
stress.
I had
Yeah.
all these different, people I was juggling, and then also when I did my work, I mean, I was doing some at the École de Pharmacie and some at the Observatoire and some at the Académie des Sciences, and there was always something en panne or en grève or whatever, and I mean, it was really,
Familiar, yes.
but anyway, that's part of the fun. But I think that I think biographies have to come alive in new ways now, and it was just very natural for me to get into. I mean, one has to, of course, rein oneself in. It can't be all speculation. You've got all kinds of steadying ballast there, but there are times when you have to make an attempt to fill in the gaps. And as you know, I had a particular device where I couldn't fill in the gaps.
You did, and we're going to address it now. Would you like to tell us what this device is?
Okay, so I did something that was maybe a bit bizarre, but it was a felt need. Let's just put it that way. I wrote letters to these women. So the book has these canonical scholarly chapters that you would expect in a monograph published by Yale. But in between, I write a letter to each of the women. My letters have questions that I was unable to answer. After years and years of work, there were things I simply could not know. And I figured my reader would like to know these things as well. And so I asked them. I also, in these letters, bring them up to date on their legacy, because one of the things that I wanted very much to do was to have these women be examples for girls going into the STEM fields, women in the STEM fields, but trying desperately to stay in the STEM fields, which is very hard. We know there's huge attrition. And I'm not delusional. I don't imagine a 9-year-old is going to read about these women from 18th century France. I honestly don't. But I think that any woman who exhibits this kind of courage and this kind of passion for science should be written about. So let me just use Lepaute as an example, the astronomer. I think she should know that there's a lunar crater named for her now, and that there's an asteroid named for her now, and that there's a street in Paris named for her now, near the new Bibliothèque Nationale, perpendicular to Rue Einstein. I get a big kick out of that. I think she should
A
know.
happy couple.
So I do, in these letters, try to bring their stories up into the present. And for me, it was just necessary to connect in some way like that. I addressed them by their first names in the letters. I mean, I came to feel that I knew them very well. And at the end, I put them together in an imaginary society where their various talents are pooled. And I think to myself, how cool that would have been. But of course, except for Biéron and Basport, I don't have any evidence that they knew each other. They should have.
I can read the quote when you imagine them in their own kind of society together. You write, "I like to imagine what it would have been like had you known and inspired one another in a mutually supportive group for women only. How you might have cross-fertilized, pooled your skills, Elizabeth's rigorous mathematical mind, Rain's understanding of celestial mechanics, Jean's vigorous observational acuity, Madeleine Francoise's keen ability to represent nature, Marie-Marguerite's knowledge of how the body works, and your discerning expertise in the lab. What a society that could have been. Short of it, I have gathered you in my mind." And this is such a lovely way to round out this talk. And it brings us back to what you said earlier about strategies versus tactics. It seems almost to me like you've developed your own tactic here, and that tactic is the letter. And this is your way of resisting this larger patriarchal tradition of the biography you're creating a space where feeling, subjectivity, speculation is allowed, encouraged, and fosters the experience of interacting with history.
Well, thank you for putting it that way. I honestly, I did not recognize my tactical maneuver there.
Well,
but
it's there. It's clear
there.
as
It's
day.
there. Thank you.
Can we have a big round of applause, please? I have many questions left, but now is the time to relinquish my power and let the audience maneuver with their own tactics. So we're going to turn to the Q&A, and we already have someone in the back. So yes.
Thank you very much for coming. My name's Nick. I'm the one who emailed you about La Légion d'honneur. And I wanted to ask you 3 questions, if I can hog the question. Why is sisterhood not used even today in French? And considering that La Maison d'éducation de la Légion d'honneur was so revolutionary and is today the wellspring of women's public education, at least in the Western world, did you find any connection with it? And the third question, it's been very interesting hearing the what, but I haven't heard the why you think women have been undercut. And you said throughout history.
I am sobered by your question, and I don't really feel equipped to answer the larger one of why women have been unappreciated or underappreciated in the history of the world, but there are roots for this. I mean, whether you're looking in the Judeo-Christian tradition or in the Greco-Roman tradition, Pandora screwed everything up. And so did Eve. But if you reread Genesis, it's pretty interesting, because what did she want? Why did she eat the fruit? Knowledge. She wanted knowledge. And so, you know, whatever tradition you look at, women have been seen as the cause for evil in the world. For your first couple of questions, I don't know about the links with the Légion d'honneur. I'm sorry. Sisterhood. Well, one of the things that actually got me started studying women, and my earlier books were about women as well. One was on the Journal des Dames, which was a periodical from 18th century France. I thought to myself, what is the Journal des Dames in the 1750s? So that I decided to write a book about it. And then the one before this was called The King's Midwife, A History and Mystery of Madame du Coudray, which was about a celebrity midwife. But I remember very early, before I had written any books, I studied the French Revolution, which fascinated me, but I was very bothered by this liberté, égalité, fraternité. I thought, where are the women? They were there. They were doing all kinds of fascinating things. Why, you know, why aren't they spoken about? So it just became my interest to find them and to pursue them.
Other questions in the room?
Yeah.
Wait, Alfonso's bringing you the microphone. The Zoom audience needs it. Thank you.
How do you fit in Madame du Châtelet in yours?
She's in the title. I'll tell you how that is. So,
And could you explain who she is?
yeah,
as
so
well,
Madame du Châtelet, if most people who have heard of a woman at all in this period have heard of Madame du Châtelet, and even she is pretty obscure. But why do some people at least know that name? Because she was Voltaire's mistress. And she was talked about from the time that she was even still alive. So she's not been erased from history, but she's been talked about as Voltaire's mistress. And only about 30, 40 years ago was she studied in her own right as a brilliant physicist. And so historians of science have done a very good job with Madame du Châtelet. I did not feel she needed any help from me. But Voltaire called her Minerva. And so the title is about her contemporaries, her less known contemporaries. But it was unnecessary to put her into my book. Yeah, but there's wonderful work done on Madame du Châtelet. Yes, she translated the Principia into French, and no one else has done it since. But not just that, she commented on it, and she did all sorts of experiments of her own. she was powerful as a thinker. But Ferrand was a Newtonian before Châtelet and before Voltaire. They were both very instrumental in popularizing Voltaire in France. But as I said, the first few decades of the 18th century, Newton was not really of interest to the French because he wasn't French. Yes.
Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Okay, I got it. Okay, so first I apologize for my interruption.
No.
Okay, and also I have read your book and it's amazing. And in fact, I misremembered. I went back and read that passage and I realized that I interpreted what you said and well, I was wrong. And so I somehow, since you had emphasized her anonymity,
Yeah.
I would say, but at the end, she wasn't so anonymous, but that's not really what
But
I
actually, I imagine you're going to ask me something else, which is
Yeah.
fine. But just so you know, you made a very honest mistake because she did indeed set a trail, right?
Yeah.
She says on Putréfaction, by the author of the translation of Shaw's Chemical Lectures, right? She translated that. She translated Monroe's work on the bones and did a beautifully illustrated traité d'ostéologie, right? So she, but again, not identifying herself. So I think what you saw was that she was linking that to previous works.
Well, that's what you said, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, I mean, this was an amazing book. I could, speaking of her very quickly, you really showed a lot about science at the time and the fact that she re-verified the claims, the experimental claims, and found them to be lacking. But that's, again, not my question. First of all, I'm a retired mathematics professor in both countries and whose mother was a physicist.
Ah.
And so I'm to some extent familiar with the difficulties faced by women scientists, as my ex-wife was a mathematician as well here in France. All right, so but
You've got credentials.
yeah, okay, sorry, but I come to this because my field of mathematics is not far from what is involved in their calculation, and so I was blown away, literally. I read those 3 pages over and over again when you described the calculations for Halley's Comet. That was to me worth everything. That was absolutely incredible the way you described that and what she did. So I'm in a position, I said all that to indicate that I'm in a position to appreciate what was needed to be done. And actually, that's where my question is. So again, this was an amazing calculation. Also, when I read the book, I somehow felt, I don't know if you emphasized that Ferrand had worked on algebraic curves. I don't remember reading that, though maybe you did, and I just forgotten that.
Ferrand worked on that.
Okay, no, Ferrand, yes. Okay, but Lepaute, so my question is this, and I apologize for being a semi-technical question, but to even set up the equations needed to calculate the orbit, the influence of Jupiter and Saturn
Right.
on the orbit of Halley's Comet, you have to know, to apply Newton's laws, the masses of the 2 planets and their relative position. And you also describe later, and so I wondered when I read that what they knew, and you describe later in the book that her experiments, her calculations with Venus helped determine the distance of the Earth to the sun,
Yes.
which is amazing, which made me wonder how they knew where Jupiter and Saturn were and what their masses were to even get started. And just one last thing, the amazing thing was just get it within a month is absolutely incredible. I mean,
Yeah.
just with, it really is. You said it was huge, but I want to say, yes, it was very huge. And the fact that this is what confirmed Newton's laws to the general public, this was amazing. And I didn't know that. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay. I think astronomers before, I mean, even back to the 17th century and perhaps even the 16th, knew where they were, knew where those planets were. Galileo knew where those planets were, so that wasn't really new news. But indeed, the calculation was just mind-boggling. No, and I don't know exactly when that was. I don't know when that was calculated. I think I'm not sure. Clairaut might have been instrumental in doing that. I don't know. But I'm glad you appreciated the extraordinary effort that was put in to doing this and to doing it in time. Yeah. Yeah. Hidden Figures, Code Girls. There are a bunch of books now that are really, Lab Girl, that are really, really interesting on what it's like for women in science, what it has been like for women in science in a more recent period.
Let's actually go to someone who hasn't had a chance to ask a question yet.
Thank you.
Hi, Dale.
Hi,
So
Professor
nice to
Patrick.
see you.
Yes, I'm a plant.
Dale was the archivist at Occidental College, where I have taught
Yeah.
for 48 years. I came as a mere child to Occidental College.
I came much later. Yes, and I learned quite a bit from you. And this is kind of where I want to ask your own history on this. How, because this gentleman has described very clearly that what you wrote in the book really demonstrates your own deep understanding and historical research in science. So how did that all come about?
Well, this is very heady. My husband is sitting back there, and he's a scientist. So that's part of the answer.
Say hi, Bill.
He's a virologist at UCLA, but he started out as a theoretical physicist. So over our more than half a century of marriage, I've been able to pick his brain on pretty much every subject from physics to biology. So we're in cahoots. So that's part of it. I was a biochem major and a history major double. So I have an interest in science that I sort of never abandoned. It's the simplest answer, I think. I'm just because of Bill, I still have one foot in the world of science, I guess, and I find it unlike anything else. I mean, and we discuss very often the difference between the humanities and the sciences and some of the ironies, because science turns out to be hugely social. And when I do my work, I'm the humanist. I come here, I disappear into an archive. I don't see a solitary soul, but I'm communing with my bundles of musty, dusty stuff that nobody's looked at for 250 years, and I'm in my zone, right? But I mean, it's interesting, the conversations that we've been able to have, and I'm so grateful for it.